The will reading happened on a Thursday morning in March 1987. Harold W. Burch had died the previous Saturday at age 71, had farmed 560 acres in Weakley County, Tennessee, since 1951. 36 years of working the same bottomland. His 4 children sat in lawyer Clifton Marsh's office in Dresden, waiting to hear how their father had divided what he'd spent a lifetime building. 3 sons. Gary, age 44, had managed a hardware store in Martin since 1969, but helped during planting and harvest when his schedule allowed. Thomas, age 41, sold insurance out of a small office on the courthouse square and came home for the heavy seasons. Russell, age 38, had worked construction in Memphis for 11 years, came back to Weakley County in 1983, said he'd always meant to farm. 1 daughter. Diane W. Burch, age 35, had never left the county. Never left the farm. Really. While her brothers built careers elsewhere and visited when it was convenient, Diane had driven out to her father's place every evening after her bookkeeping shift at the grain elevator. Every weekend without exception. For 15 years she had kept Harold's records, negotiated his grain contracts, scouted his fields, and maintained his equipment in the unheated tin shed behind the machine barn. She knew the break-even yield on every field. She knew which hydraulic lines were due for replacement before they failed in the middle of a field 8 miles from the nearest parts house. She knew that farm the way you only know something you have given years of quiet, uncredited labor to. Clifton Marsh was 61, had handled Harold's legal affairs since 1968. He opened the will, set his reading glasses straight, moved through the standard language about sound mind and final wishes, and came to the distribution of assets. To my son Gary Burch, I leave 186 acres, the north parcel, including all improvements thereon. Gary nodded, expected. He'd helped when he could. To my son Thomas Burch, I leave 186 acres, the east parcel, including all grain handling infrastructure. Thomas exhaled slowly. Fair ground, well-drained, good corn history. To my son Russell Burch, I leave 186 acres, the south parcel, including the equipment barn and all outbuildings thereon. Russell looked surprised and then pleased. He'd get his chance to come back to the land after all. Do it right this time. Clifton paused. He looked at Diane across the desk. To my daughter Diane W. Burch, I leave my 1962 Farmall 560 diesel tractor, serial number FBH 44291, free and clear of all encumbrances. The room went quiet. Not the quiet of grief, the quiet of a verdict being absorbed. Gary spoke first, confusion moving across his face before he could arrange it into something more diplomatic. That's it? She gets the tractor. Just the tractor. Clifton checked the document, though he had read it correctly the first time. The land is divided equally among the 3 sons. Diane receives the 1962 Farmall 560. Thomas looked at the table. Russell said nothing. Diane reached across, took the tractor title from Clifton's hand, folded it once along the center crease, and put it in the inside pocket of her jacket. When she looked up, her face was composed in a way that was difficult to read. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly. Something that had already moved past both of those into someplace quieter and more purposeful. Dad made his decision, she said. He had his reasons. She drove home alone, sat at her kitchen table in the small 2-bedroom house she owned free and clear on the east side of Dresden. Set the tractor title on the table in front of her and looked at it for a long time. Her 3 brothers had just inherited 560 acres of Weakley County bottomland. 186 acres each, at $1,100 per acre, just over $205,000 apiece. $500,000 in land divided 3 ways, passed to 3 men who had spent the better part of their adult lives somewhere else. She had inherited 1 tractor, 25 years old, faded red paint, somewhere around 9,000 hours on the engine, worth perhaps $2,800 if she could find the right buyer. She did not call her brothers that evening. She did not call anyone. She got out a yellow legal pad and started writing numbers. 3 sons inherited $500,000 in Tennessee farmland. Their sister got a worn-out tractor worth $2,800. 12 years later, only she still farmed. Only she still owned land. Only she had built something that lasted. This is how Diane W. Burch went from a tractor title on a kitchen table to owning every acre her father ever farmed. and why the men who inherited everything ended up with nothing. Welcome back to American Farm Tales. And if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button. Because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones that don't make the evening news but probably should. Harold Burch farmed Weakley County, Tennessee for 36 years. Same ground, same seasons, same stubborn faith that if you worked it right, the land would hold. He raised tobacco when tobacco still paid, rotated into soybeans when it didn't, ran corn through the wet years and the dry ones. He built something real, not inherited, not lucky, just built, through decades of hard mornings and harder decisions. By the time Harold passed, that farm represented a life's work in the most literal sense a man could mean it. And Diane Burch knew that farm better than anyone alive. She was Harold's daughter, not a hired hand, not a neighbor who helped out at harvest, his daughter. And for 15 years she was the one keeping the books, not glancing at them, keeping them. She maintained the farm records through every crop cycle, tracked every equipment service interval, and knew, not guessed, knew, the break-even yield on every field they planted. When a piece of machinery started running rough, it was Diane walking out to that cold tin equipment shed to assess it. While the calendar still had weeks before her brothers would have noticed anything was wrong. She negotiated grain sales at the co-op. She scouted fields in the evenings, walking rows, checking pressure, reading the crop. On the same nights her brothers were home watching television, she wasn't doing this for extra credit. She was doing it because someone had to. And she was the one who cared enough to show up. She knew which fields held moisture and which drained fast. She knew what the farm owed and what it was worth. She could have told you, on any given Tuesday in October, exactly where Harold Burch stood financially and what the next 12 months were going to require. Harold's will gave her $2,800, not a share of the land, not a stake in the operation she had spent 15 years sustaining. $2,800, roughly what a decent used tractor tire costs, while her brothers divided the ground she had walked and the equipment she had kept running. That number is not an abstraction. It is not a legal technicality or a family misunderstanding that got smoothed over at the estate attorney's office. It is a specific dollar figure attached to a specific woman's 15 years of specific work. And that specificity is exactly why Diane Burch's case matters. Not just to her family, not just to Weakley County, but to every farm family where the person holding everything together is also the one the paperwork forgets. This is her story, and it starts with what the will didn't say. Diane could have fought the will. A lawyer in Jackson had already told her she had a credible case, 15 years of documented labor, tax filings that showed her involvement, co-op records with her signature on the grain tickets. She had the paperwork to make Harold's estate uncomfortable. She had the standing to make it expensive for everyone. She didn't file. She also didn't take Gary's offer. Her oldest brother had come to her quietly, the way men do when they want something to look generous, and put a number on the table. Cash compensation, a clean settlement, a way for the family to move forward without the courts involved. It was the kind of offer that sounds reasonable right up until you realize you'd be selling 15 years of your life for whatever Gary decided it was worth that afternoon. She didn't take it. What she did instead was sit at her kitchen table with a legal pad and work through the only thing she actually had. One tractor, paid for. And that, she decided, was the thing that mattered most. Not its horsepower, not its age, but the fact that no bank had a claim on it. Paid-for equipment doesn't compound against you in a bad year. Paid for is the only kind of equipment that doesn't eventually own you back. She had watched that truth play out on her father's farm for 3 decades, and she understood it in her bones. She also knew 2 women worth talking to. Edna Hollis was 71, farming 60 acres east of Dresden that had gone unworked since her husband's bypass. Marvella Crane was 68, same situation, 60 acres she could no longer manage alone. Diane drove to both of them. She didn't send letters. She drove out, sat down at their kitchen tables, and made her pitch. Cash rent arrangements at $90 an acre, above the going market rate. She was offering more than they could get elsewhere because she needed them to say yes, and she was honest enough not to pretend otherwise. Edna said yes in 4 days. Marvella said yes in 6. Then Diane walked into First Federal Savings in Dresden and asked for $14,500. The loan officer read her application the way loan officers do. Carefully, and with visible skepticism, she let him finish. Then she put her house deed on the table. He approved it the same week. She signed her name and walked out into a Dresden afternoon with more debt than she'd ever carried and 120 acres of other people's ground to farm. Nobody in Weakley County thought she knew what she was doing. Some said so out loud. Most just watched and waited for the part where she proved them right. She had already decided that part wasn't coming. The first winter was the kind that tests whether a decision was courage or just stubbornness, dressed up to look like it. Every evening after dark, Diane was in the equipment shed behind her house with the Farmall 560, a 1962 model, International red gone dull with age, the kind of tractor that gets called a classic by people who've never had to depend on one. She wasn't restoring it, she was reckoning with it, cleaning the carburetor by hand, checking valve clearances with a feeler gauge, replacing hydraulic lines that hadn't failed yet but would, because she understood the difference between a line that fails in the shed and a line that fails in the middle of a field in May, when every hour of daylight costs money she doesn't have. She worked by a single drop light. The shed wasn't heated. Gary came by one February evening, headlights swinging across the frozen yard. He got out, looked at the situation, his sister flat on her back under a tractor in 20-degree cold, and offered the use of his shop. Heated concrete floor, fluorescent lights, the full set of tools their father had accumulated over a lifetime. He meant it genuinely. That's the part worth saying clearly. Gary was not a villain. He was a man who had inherited something he didn't entirely understand the cost of, and he was trying to be decent about the rest of it. Diane thanked him and declined. Not out of pride, though people assumed that. She declined because she understood something about her situation that Gary's offer, however kindly meant, would have softened in exactly the wrong way. Gary had 186 acres of Weakley County ground in his name. If farming stopped working for him? Bad year, bad market, bad knees. He listed the land with an ag real estate broker and walked away with somewhere north of $200,000. Farming was one option among several. It was a life he could exit. Diane had a house the county assessed at $22,000 and a tractor worth $2,800. If this didn't work, there was no secondary plan waiting behind it. No land to liquidate. No asset to fall back on. Nothing. Most people would call that vulnerability. Diane had spent the winter deciding it was something else entirely. When you have a fallback, you fall back. It happens gradually and then all at once. A shortcut here, a deferred repair there, a decision that would have gone differently if you couldn't afford to get it wrong. Diane couldn't afford to get it wrong, which meant she didn't. She checked the hydraulic lines in February so they wouldn't fail in May. She worked in the cold because the cold was honest about what she was actually dealing with. Gary's heated shop would have been comfortable. Diane had already decided comfort wasn't what this winter was for. Spring came to Weakley County in 1988, the way it always does. Fast and then cold again, teasing, making you second-guess every planting decision you'd already committed to. Diane was in the field by the first week of April, with the old Farmall, working her 120 rented acres in careful, deliberate passes, while her brothers were already finishing their ground and moving on to other things. It took her nearly 3 weeks to plant what Gary and Thomas covered in 10 days. They had newer equipment, wider planters, the kind of machinery that lets a man feel efficient. Diane didn't have any of that. What she had was time she was willing to spend and attention she couldn't afford to shortcut. She adjusted planter depth field by field as the soil changed under her. Because it does change, acre by acre, and most people just pick a setting and live with the variance. She scouted twice a week, walking rows in the evenings the way she always had, reading the crop the way her father never quite taught her, but she'd learned anyway. On the tractor seat beside her, a yellow legal pad tracked every input dollar in her own handwriting. Seed cost, fuel cost, chemical cost, the number she was farming toward, and the number she couldn't go below. Her brothers moved differently. They moved with the particular ease of men farming ground they own outright, ground that was handed to them, that exists beneath their feet regardless of how the season turns out. Gary spent comfortably because comfort was available to him. Thomas ran his operation the way inherited confidence tends to run things. Forward-leaning, not especially worried, certain that the land would absorb whatever the year didn't produce. Russell, farming seriously for what was essentially the first time in his adult life, was mostly focused on keeping his equipment payments current and calling it even. When the numbers came in at the end of that first season, they told a story nobody in the family was quite ready to hear. Diane grossed $19,400 on her 120 rented acres. After all costs, rent, inputs, fuel, the loan payment, every line on the legal pad, she netted $5,800. She saved $4,600 of it. For a woman who'd started the year with a paid-off tractor and a bank loan secured against a $22,000 house, that was not a small number. That was a foundation. Gary netted roughly $28,000 and spent $24,000 of it. Thomas netted $22,000 and spent most of that. Russell covered his equipment payments and declared the year a success, which it was, in the way that not losing is a kind of winning when your name is already on the deed. The gap between Diane's numbers and her brother's numbers looked like losing. It wasn't. It was the difference between building and spending. And that difference, quiet as it was in the fall of 1988, was already compounding. From the outside, the late 1980s looked good on all four Burch siblings. Soybean prices held firm. Tennessee land values were stable, the kind of stable that makes people stop checking. The agricultural economy in Weakley County had the feel of a thing that was simply working, and nobody had much reason to look underneath it. Gary bought a new truck. A good one. The kind a man buys when he wants the county to know the farm is doing well, which is its own kind of accounting. Thomas put a deck on the back of his house that summer. Pressure-treated lumber and a gas grill, and a view of ground his father had broken decades before him. Russell loaded his family into the car and drove them to the Smoky Mountains for a week, the first real vacation he'd taken since inheriting the farm, and came back talking about going again next year. Diane drove a 9-year-old Buick. She lived in the same small house she'd put up as collateral at First Federal. She ate cheap, not as a gesture, but as a practice. The same way she tracked input costs on a legal pad, the same way she checked hydraulic lines before they failed. She watched the years roll through and kept doing the same quiet arithmetic. Every dollar the farm earned that didn't have to go somewhere else went into savings. By the end of 1990, she had $19,000 set aside, not invested in anything optimistic. Set aside in an account she could reach, earning modest interest while she waited to understand what she was actually saving it for. Her brothers had spent nearly everything their farms earned. Not recklessly. That's the important distinction. Reasonably. Normally. The way men spend money when the money keeps coming in and there's no particular sign that it won't. New equipment, home improvements, modest comforts. The ordinary texture of a life that feels like it's working. What none of them were watching closely enough were the equipment loans. Variable rate financing had seemed like a reasonable choice when rates were moving the right direction. It seems reasonable right up until it doesn't. Through 1989 and into 1990, interest rate adjustments were quietly adding to monthly payments that Gary and Thomas and Russell had built their operating budgets around. Not dramatically, not yet, just persistently. The kind of change that doesn't feel urgent until it is. In Nashville, agricultural lenders were beginning to talk to each other about regional credit stress in the farm sector. They were tracking exposure, reviewing portfolios, having the careful internal conversations that precede the less careful external ones. Farm borrowers in Weakley County were not having those conversations. There was no reason to, as far as most of them could see. The prices were holding, the land was still there, the deck was done, the truck ran well, and the Smokies had been beautiful. The trap doesn't announce itself. That's what makes it a trap. The credit contraction came to West Tennessee the way agricultural contractions always do. Not as a single event, but as a series of smaller tightenings, each one manageable on its own, none of them manageable in sequence. By 1991, farm lenders in the region had stopped being accommodating in the quiet ways they'd been accommodating for years. Loan renewals that had been routine required more documentation. Operating lines that had been extended without much conversation suddenly required conversations. The men who had borrowed comfortably during the good years were beginning to understand that comfort had terms attached to it that nobody had read closely enough. Then 1993 brought drought to West Tennessee. Not the worst on record. Just enough. Yields came in short on Diane's rented acres and shorter on her brother's owned ground. A bad year on rented ground costs you margin. A bad year on leveraged ground costs you margin and keeps charging you for the equipment anyway. Soybean prices broke in 1994. Not a correction, a break down to levels that made debt service arithmetic stop working for anyone carrying real load. Diane's gross income dropped. She felt it. Her rent obligations to Edna Hollis and Marvella Crane didn't move, and she wouldn't have asked them to. Those women had said yes when she needed yes, and she wasn't going to be the kind of person who renegotiated when things got hard. So she looked at the other side of the ledger instead. Her fixed costs were rent, inputs, and a small life insurance premium she'd held since her 30s. No equipment debt. Not a single payment owed to a bank on anything that turned a wheel. She cut personal spending to almost nothing, which, given how she'd been living since 1988, meant cutting to a level most people wouldn't recognize as a life. She survived the year. She survived 1993. She survived 1994. Each year cost her savings progress, but nothing came for what she'd already put away. Her brothers could not do what she did. The equipment payments followed them, regardless of what the crop brought in. A drought year, a price break, a bad stand, none of it adjusted the payment schedule. The bank wanted its money on the date it wanted its money, and the soybean market's opinion of that arrangement was not relevant. Russell broke first. He'd been the least prepared of the three. Farming ground he hadn't earned, with equipment he'd financed at the start of his stewardship, with none of the instinct that comes from him having built something rather than received it. By mid-1994, he was missing payments. He negotiated extensions. The extensions didn't hold. The bank began its process, which is a careful phrase for a thing that feels anything but careful when it's happening to you. That same year, Diane had $31,000 in savings and was watching Weakley County land prices fall to levels she hadn't seen since before her father's will was read. She recognized the moment for what it was. Russell's auction was on a Thursday morning in April 1995, the kind of spring day that would have been pleasant under other circumstances. The auctioneer set up near the barn. A small crowd came out. Neighbors, investors, a few men from Nashville with ag portfolios looking for distressed ground at distressed prices. Russell stood to one side in a collared shirt, the kind of outfit a man wears when he wants to look like he's holding up. The 186 acres went at $880 per acre. After the bank settled what Russell owed, he walked away with $14,000 from ground that had been worth $205,000 8 years earlier. He shook some hands. He drove away. Diane had stood at the back of the crowd and watched every minute of it. She did not bid. Thomas held on 2 more years through a combination of stubbornness and a production loan he probably shouldn't have been approved for in 1995. His auction came in the fall of 1997. Same sequence, same arithmetic, slightly different numbers. His 186 acres sold at $910 per acre. After the bank, Thomas netted $21,000. He'd been farming Harold Burch's inheritance for nearly a decade, and ended with less money than a decent used combine. Diane stood at the back of that auction too. She did not bid. Not because she didn't want the ground, because she wasn't ready yet, and she knew the difference between wanting something and being positioned to take it. Gary made it to 1999. He had managed the best of the three. Tighter than Russell, more attentive than Thomas, genuinely trying to run the thing like a business. It wasn't enough. The debt load he'd built during the comfortable years had followed him through too many hard ones. And by 1999, the bank had run out of patience and Gary had run out of options. His 186 acres went to auction that September, including the home place, the farmstead Harold Burch had maintained for 30 years, the buildings Diane had walked through her entire life, the ground her father had broken and kept and believed in. It sold at $940 per acre. Gary got $19,000. Diane was at the back of the crowd again. But this time she was holding a cashier's check, and she had done the math on every parcel before the auctioneer opened his mouth. When the bidding reached the home place, the house, the outbuildings, the 40 acres surrounding them, she raised her hand and she kept it raised. She won it. She drove home that evening on roads she had driven her entire life, past fields she had scouted on foot, past the equipment shed behind her house where she had worked alone on a cold February night in 1988 with a drop light and a feeler gauge, and no particular reason to believe any of this was coming. She was a landowner now, Harold Burch's daughter, on Harold Burch's ground. It had taken her 12 years to get back to the starting line. The first land she ever owned she bought in 1994 from an estate sale 3 counties over. 120 acres at $870 per acre, $104,400 total. She put $31,000 down, which was nearly everything she had saved since 1988, and financed the remainder through First Federal, the same bank where she'd put her house deed on the table 6 years earlier. The loan officer remembered her. He approved it faster this time. That purchase had nothing to do with her father's farm. It was just good ground at a distressed price during years when distressed prices were available to anyone with capital and the patience to look. Diane had spent 6 years building exactly that position. Not for any specific opportunity, but because she understood, in the way people understand things they've learned the hard way, that the moment always comes and you either have the money when it does, or you don't. By 1998, she had rebuilt her savings enough to move on Thomas's former ground. She didn't wait for another auction. She called the bank holding the note directly and asked if they wanted to negotiate a private sale. They did. Banks holding distressed agricultural paper in rural Tennessee in 1998 were not sentimental about the process. She paid $910 per acre, $169,000 total, $58,000 down. She financed the rest. She signed the papers in a conference room in Dresden and drove home past fields she had watched Thomas plant badly for years, now hers to plant correctly. Gary's parcel she bought at the courthouse steps in 2001, the home place. The outbuildings Harold had maintained with his own hands for 3 decades. The 40 surrounding acres where Diane had walked rows as a girl and then as a woman doing work her brothers weren't doing. She had attended that auction the previous fall with a cashier's check and a number she'd calculated weeks in advance. She bid $940 per acre. She won. She drove home. By 2002, Diane W. Burch owned 480 acres of Weakley County farmland. That figure requires a moment to sit with. Harold Burch had spent 36 years assembling ground through hard work and harder decades, building something real from nothing comfortable. His will had valued his daughter's contribution to that enterprise at $2,800. She had taken that figure, and a paid-off tractor, and 15 years of knowledge nobody had thought to compensate. And she had built back, acre by acre, cashier's check by cashier's check, year by patient year, the near entirety of what he left behind. She didn't put a sign at the road. She didn't call anyone to tell them what she'd done. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no moment where she stood in the middle of Harold's home place and made it mean something out loud. She just kept farming. The ground didn't need a speech. It needed to be worked. Diane had always understood that better than anyone. Spring came early to Weakley County in 2019, the way it does in good years, and Diane W. Burch was 67 years old when she signed the papers that sold 480 acres of West Tennessee bottomland at $3,800 per acre. Gross proceeds, $1,824,000. After remaining debt service and capital gains taxes, she netted approximately $1.74 million. From a paid-off tractor and a $14,500 loan secured against a house worth $22,000. From 15 years of farm records and cold shed evenings and grain marketing negotiations that her father's will had valued at $2,800. The final tallies on her brothers are worth saying plainly, because the contrast is the point, and the contrast is true. Russell died in 2017 at 68 years old, with less than $9,000 in savings. He had spent the last 20 years of his life working warehouse jobs in Jackson, Tennessee, the same county where he'd once auctioned on 86 acres of inherited farmland for $880 per acre and walked away with $14,000. He didn't live to see Diane's sale. Thomas was 76 in 2019, living in a rental apartment in Union City on Social Security and a small annuity. The ground his father broke, the ground he farmed carelessly through the good years and lost in the hard ones, was by then part of someone else's operation entirely. Gary retired in 2011 from a parts counter job at a farm equipment dealer in Martin. He was living on $1,400 a month in combined benefits, comfortable enough in the way that enough is enough when it's all there is. He was still alive in 2019, still in Weakley County. Close enough to know what his sister had done with the ground he lost, and far enough from it that there was nothing left to say about it. In 2022, the West Tennessee Farm Bureau newsletter ran a short piece on Diane. The interviewer asked whether she had ever resented her father for the will. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I resented him for about a week. Then I realized he'd handed me something my brothers never got. He handed me necessity. And necessity, if you're paying attention, is the best teacher there is." She is still living in her own home in Dresden. Still sharp, still farming in the ways that matter, watching markets, reading land, thinking in decades. That's the story of Diane W. Burch. If it stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed to American Farm Tales yet, now's the time. There are more stories like this one, and we're just getting started.